I want to once again thank all of our panelists. We've had a terrific first day so far of presentations, questions. As someone once said, good questions outrank easy answers. Nobody tried to give us easy answers, and I thought all the questions from commission members and public were really excellent and will help us a lot. Today's presentations and the questions and answers, I've spoken to all our commission members at our break, and they've really helped us. One possible answer to the question of how we're going to process different worldviews, faith-based views, non-faith-based views, is let me just answer that quite directly from my own perspective, is that we would be unwise to think we have the answers now before listening to different perspectives and listening to the arguments and reasons that they give. When it comes to writing our report, we will write what we think is the best advice and recommendations to the President, given what our charge is. And we will do so with all respect to the views we've heard, but not in entire agreement with all the views we've heard. That would be impossible. It may be that we don't entirely agree with any of the views we've heard, but we will do our very best, but only arriving at conclusions after we hear more, and this is the beginning, and so far an excellent beginning. That said, I don't want to lose any time, and I'm going to open it up and to the there you go.
Sorry.
No, you have no apologies. Thank you very much for the heroic effort to get another microphone here. So the question I want to lead off with is a very direct question, and I want direct and succinct answers for the presenters. And that is, if there's one recommendation you could make to us for what we should include in our report, what would it be? Just one. I know it's hard to pick just one, but it would be helpful for us to know what you think is really important that we address. Bonnie.
I would say you have to be very careful not to restrict the creativity, the ingenuity, and the innovation of scientists going forward in this field.
Other. Let me just read, if I can, the charge to the Commission in the letter that I received, May 20th letter. Do we have the letter? Yeah. I did have it, because I think it outlines our charge very well. Here we go. So let me just to give you a moment so it asks us, and when you're asked by the President to do something, it's my philosophy that one does it. It is especially when it's as reasonable as this is. In its study, the Commission should consider the potential medical, environmental, security, and other benefits of this field of research, as well as any potential health, security, or other risks. Further, the Commission should develop recommendations about any actions the federal government should take to ensure that America reaps the benefits of this developing field of science while identifying appropriate ethical boundaries and minimizing identified risks. Now, the one interesting fact about this charge is that it asks us to develop recommendations that ensure that America reaps the benefits of this developing field of science while identifying ethical boundaries and minimizing risks. And I say that because, Bonnie, your recommendation to us is absolutely consistent with this charge. Jim, would you like to chime in absolute agreement? No, or counterpoint, perhaps?
Oh, no, alongside that. I think an appropriate boundary is the laboratory door, and that this technology kept within the laboratory door is an opportunity for the creativity and imagination of scientists to further understand the frontier of knowledge. But that's a boundary that shouldn't be crossed at this time. So no environmental or commercial release would be a
And let
boundary.
me just say that several people mentioned the precautionary principle without defining it, but the definition that I've seen in the literature of the precautionary principle is don't go ahead until one can prove there are no risks. Is that too strong, Jim?
There are several definitions of the precautionary principle.
Well, just so we have a...
Where there is evidence of risk, of harm, even when that harm isn't yet proven, that shouldn't be a basis on not moving ahead.
Okay.
So it's not as straightforward as don't do it until you can prove it's safe. You can never prove anything in the world is safe. But where there are concerns, you don't need overwhelming evidence of lack of safety, of risk, to stop something. You can stop something with just some evidence.
Okay. Well, that's good, because in something that et cetera wrote, it was even stronger than that. But I'll take that. Alan, I don't want to get sidetracked.
Go back to your statement for a moment.
Yes.
I would emphasize not just benefits to the USA, but to mankind, to humankind. That is, I don't think this should be a sort of, I know you're not saying this, sort of rah-rah national, let's get ahead on synthetic biology for the U.S. I really think you need to think about the benefits to human beings and the distribution of the benefits and the risks, because the people who are benefiting the most may not be the people who are bearing the greatest risks. So I would take a more cosmopolitan view.
Great. 2 points you made. One is we don't need to stop at the boundaries of this country. But the second point is to think about the distribution of the benefits and the risks and the harms. And that, I think, is something that nobody here has disagreed with. I mean, people may have different views of that. But it's very important for us that is part of what we see as the charge of ethics and social responsibility. We're really, in the charge, it's interpreted quite broadly, and I think legitimately so. Yes?
There are many different mechanisms you can use to regulate a technology, and I think the Commission has to think seriously about which regulatory mechanisms they're going to recommend, insofar as they need to recommend a mechanism that is both flexible enough to be nimble in a rapidly changing technology that's going to be different 5 years from now than it is now. So you don't want draconian or overarching regulations that stifle innovation, and yet can also respond to new situations to limit or stop things that might actually end up being dangerous. So you need more of an oversight committee kind of way of thinking about it, though that an oversight committee may not be the exact correct mechanism. Then you need a set of laws on the books that right now create boundaries of this technology.
Yes.
Hi. I as I have said before, I don't think there's been enough discussion of specific cases of environmental risk and what they involve and harms. And I feel that it may be time for the National Academy of Sciences to put out a report on, what are the potential harms that we need to be concerned about, and this could serve a double purpose. I almost said dual use. A double purpose of educating the public and also moving the conversation forward to be away from sound bites, which I don't like we're going to save the environment and we're going to, have biofuels that are like wonderful with no consequences. I feel like a more deep analysis by, for example, a committee of the National Academy of Sciences, an NRC committee, would be a very good outcome.
Interesting. Jim, we have yes, go ahead.
I think looking back at what we've did for the past 10 or 15 years on nanotech, I think there's some interesting lessons there. And it's not a perfect analogy, but as Jim said, it rhymes. And I think the thing that we didn't do early enough and seriously enough was look at implications research. Okay, so there's a tendency to push the gas ahead on the applications and the brake on the implications. All right, now, there's three things that have to happen to sort of send the message to the world that you're serious about implications. The government needs a strategy that goes beyond biosecurity, has to basically include the biosafety issues. You need more agencies involved, the EPA, OSHA, FDA, the Forest Service. They all have to be in the room. You've got to have some serious money funding research that's going to the right agencies and the right research institutions. So we're talking tens of millions, because right now we're nickel and diming the implications research. And you need periodic review by the National Academy. In the case of nanotech, we use PCAST, and we also use the General Accountability Office. So I think that whole piece of being able to say we're doing the applications, but we're also very aware of the implications, not just the environmental ones, but some of the social ones that Jim was talking about. And we're serious enough to put serious money behind it. We have a strategy, and we're making sure that's evaluated on a regular, periodic basis.
And this underlines the point that we really take seriously that it's much better to do things proactively and to really assess risks and take the measures that are needed ahead of time rather than waiting.
Right, and I think this is something that the public wants. They expect it. I think this idea of being able to get the research ahead of public concerns is extremely important.
Good.
Even if you don't have the answers, be able to say there's a serious effort there to get them.
Yeah. Yes.
I can just follow up on that. I think, and I'm sure David would agree with this, a key element of that is transparency. In our typical regulatory regime now, risk data is generated by private companies that are going to an agency for an approval process. Very little of that information is made publicly available. It's been one of the great debates on genetically engineered organisms that, because of confidentiality and other restrictions, those risk assessment decisions get made essentially behind closed doors. So that if we can have a publicly funded research effort that looks at risk assessment methodologies, looks at implications research, makes that transparent as good science should be done, I think that will go a long way not only to developing this body of knowledge in parallel with the development of the technology, but also helping to build public confidence that the technology is being discussed in the open, and to build a knowledge base for the regulatory agencies when they need to use it.
Good. Got it. George.
Yeah, so I'll try to frame this as the one recommendation, but it's also I'm being quite reactive to what's going on in the room, in a positive way, hopefully here. But I would actually, and this will sound ironic, I would go further than Jim is going in the sense that I actually think that drawing the line between commercial and academic is dangerous in the sense that I think that academics are capable of releasing things into the environment that could be much more problematic than what a company would do because of all the extra steps that go into approval and investors and so forth, while an academic, especially an unrestricted and creative one, as Bonnie would have us do. Now, I'm not saying I want to, no, as Bonnie would like to have us all be. And so I also would like us to be unrestricted and creative, but I think that drawing this line with commercial is not. And so what we need is something, not just one NAS report, but an ongoing report that's going on all the time where we're constantly doing cost-benefit analysis. And I think that that is best done in the context of a larger project. And, for example, the Genome Project set aside a considerable fraction of its sums to ethical, legal, and social implications. I would add to that policy and economic considerations. That would be my one recommendation.
That actually picks up on Nancy's and Allison's continual reassessment and a mechanism in place.
But it has to be integrated into.
Right.
Yeah.
Other one suggestions? Yes.
This is the best conversation I've seen on synthetic biology since I've been involved with it. And I think that has to do with the fact that it's coupled to the president and it is coupled to executive leadership. And to complement the two remarks around sustaining what leadership can do in this field, you're unlikely, even in the best case scenario, to get everything sorted as the world is today within the deadlines you've got. And it's certainly the case that things will change. And so there can be no question that there has to be some sustaining activity. But I think what we're finding here, and I guess this would be my one amendment to sustaining activity, is to enable one to be ethical in this field. One also has to consider how to enable the field. And so it's not a typical discussion of bioethics. It's a discussion of how investments and technology development and the science and the law and the ethics all come together. And I don't know, I've never seen a sustaining venue that enables all of that to happen, but you've sort of captured it here somehow, right? And so maybe it's this group of people or the next version of us with a different name, but let me encourage it to not just be a sustaining consideration of benefits, dangers, costs, but how we actually make this all work.
Yeah. Well, we have captured it, and there needs to be a we going forward that doesn't simply issue a report into a black hole. We need some ongoing, it came up, education and understanding of whatever turns out to be a set of reasonable recommendations for how we can both benefit from and minimize identifiable risks.
Let me try and
go ahead.
Say something more clearly. I think it's very significant to have executive leadership on this topic. And I think whenever you're trying to do something new, there's skepticism about utility, there's concern about risk, and there's just disbelief.
Yeah.
And so I think there are log jams all over the place where people want to be working together on this in different agencies at different levels, but they're not enabled. And there's something very powerful and special and essential about having executive leadership associated with leading.
Mm-hmm. Good. We've got it. Christella.
One of the things that's come up over the course of today is how exciting this technology is, and particularly how it's percolating down to younger and younger people, and perhaps in a distributed way to people outside of institutions. So the one recommendation I would like to see, and I don't know the answer to this, I'll say that up front, but I think there needs to be considerable thought as we go forward thinking about risks and regulations and how all those interplay with one another and interact with one another. How do you have that conversation in the context of extra institutional or non-institutional players or participants, and figuring out a way to be educated about that and to be as constructive as possible to still have the surveillance that George has talked about and the monitoring that others have talked about, but to not automatically think that immediately goes to what our federally funded researchers and academic universities doing.
Yeah. So this, I think, raises to the higher level what Drew earlier said about wanting it to be do it together rather than do it yourself. That's very good. Good. I'm going to just invite not only the presenters but anybody in the public, just urge you, anyone who's interested, to send us written comments. We, the Commission, will read them. And I'm urging you to think about the one thing that you want us to address in the report, because we'll read whatever you send us, but I'm telling you what would be really helpful if we've just discovered what is truly important to you rather than a long, long list, which we would also read, but it won't be as helpful as this kind of really focusing on what we need to do to make our recommendations in these deliberations most productive. And with that, I'm going to ask Jim if he wants to ask.
Yeah, I'm dying to ask some questions, but I also know, would you mind if we intersperse some of the public questions? I know I saw people pop up when you said those of you who have input for us, they charge the microphone.
Charge up. Why doesn't someone pop up quickly? But I also want to give commission members time. Well. So we'll intersperse it. I was going to do it in order, but we can.
I feel like I shortchanged them in that last session.
I see.
It's guilt. Yes.
We'll compensate. I have a lot of Jewish guilt too. So here we go.
Hi, I'm Gerald Epstein at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I guess my one recommendation is to be very clear about implicit assumptions that you may be building into something you say. The domain of the study is synthetic biology, but lots of the things we've talked about pertain to innovation as a whole, or biotechnology as a whole, or social equity as a whole. To the extent synthetic biology cannot make other problems worse, it's certainly worth bringing these up. But if the net effect to focus on synthetic biology when your goal is actually much broader than that is to distort the innovation plane or to not actually solve the bigger problem, then that's a concern. One example might be, pardon me for picking on you, Jim, but the criticism about going into a bioeconomy. If you're worried about that, the consequences of going to a bioeconomy, there's 4 things that are the alternative to that. 1, you love fossil fuels, that's great. 2, there's a new kind of technology that's going to solve the problem outside of our domain, and we'll just hope that takes care of it. 3, we'll go globally to a lower energy intensity. Or 4, we'll find some way to get rid of a couple billion people because the planet can't support all of them. So be clear on what the assumptions you're making when you focus on some domain.
Yes, we will definitely do that, and we are not going to, I can assure you, we're not going to pick on synthetic biology and blame it for all of the world's problems or see it as a cure or its prohibition as a cure for all of the world's problems. So that point was not lost on us. I'm glad that you made it, but it's also our charge to look at synthetic biology broadly, not only for what it has done to date, but what its implications are moving forward and how it relates to other fields, hence the kinds of
connected with that,
questions.
actually,
ahead,
comes
Jim.
in questions on my head. If we can't get this answered, let's give it like two minutes to see if it converges. But I do wonder if one of the contributions the committee could make might actually, apropos of the comment just made, to be able to give a better definition to what we understand synthetic biology to be. I went back over my notes. I have 5 definitions that we were offered, and they're not necessarily complementary, ranging from DNA construction to be the number one technology of the 21st century to having it defined as synthetic genomics. It must exist in digital code, be processed to synthesize genome, activated in a living system, to others saying, this is really just an extension of genetic engineering, and in fact, one person saying there's no clear distinction between synthetic biology and genetic engineering. We had one definition that was offered as a definition saying it was making biology easier to engineer. If all of those are true and you're just asking the commission to kind of sweep them into a whole, we can try to do that. But I hate to have all these scientists leave the room without my having asked, have I missed the definition for synthetic biology?
You haven't gotten them all.
Yeah, that's probably right.
Well, I remember Prather, Dr. Prather told us if you had 5 in the room, we'd get 6 definitions. Mm-hmm. So let's see if we can get another one.
I refuse. I refuse. And my counsel to you would be don't stress out about it too much. Okay. I've seen, particularly in Europe, meeting after meeting after meeting, creating meeting after meeting after meeting, with the primary agenda item being to come to a consensus definition.
Then I suggest we don't discuss it further.
I can reach a consensus on that one. Let me just say, I got a note here that says, next time you invite commentary, you can mention our public email address. So I'm going to invite commentary again in order to mention our public email address. Info, it's really easy, info@bioethics.gov. Nita.
So this may not be a fruitful question in light of the abandonment of trying to find any definition of synthetic biology, but what I'm hoping is for some idea of what the unique risks are that are posed by synthetic biology as opposed to any of the other fields that we've discussed today. And this may be difficult to characterize if we don't have a clear sense of what's included and what isn't, but really what's different in the risk that this field poses as opposed to previous fields or previous types of biotechnology?
The answer can be nothing. Yeah.
I can't speak to this comprehensively, but in the Sloan Foundation study done with Dr. Epstein and Garfinkel and Friedman on synthesis of DNA, we face the same challenge? What's unique about the tools, process, science of synthetic biology from a risk perspective? And in this case, we're looking at oftentimes security risks. Mm-hmm. And to just give you a specific example, we identified 3 types of viruses for which direct synthesis from information would be the best available technology for providing access. Mm-hmm. So things that weren't available, that didn't exist at this time, the 1918 influenza, things that are locked up, smallpox, or things for which the natural reservoir is not clear, Ebola. And beyond that, it seemed that there wasn't a specific delta increase in risk due to the tools bounded within an arbitrary, ambiguous definition of the field. I haven't seen it done beyond security and human pathogens, but I'm sure you could quickly work that up and sketch out how big a puzzle it is.
Yeah. The parallel question, by the way, is what are some of the unique benefits of the field? Jim?
I just wanted to throw an extra, what I think is an example of a sort of a unique thing that comes out of synthetic biology. Although it's an extension of an existing problem, it's unique in how it plays out. And that's in the ability to enable digital biopiracy, which hasn't come up yet. And biopiracy is a clear bioethical issue. Up until now, ever since the 16th century, if you wanted to take biological materials from communities, say in the global south, you'd have to go there, take them, physically remove them. And now we have an international regime being put in place to try and prevent that movement of biological materials. Synthetic biology means that, in fact, you don't have to go there at all, that you can download it from the internet. You can upload it to the internet and send it as information. So that's a difference in kind that I think is unique.
Commission members, questions? Raju.
I was struck by a couple of comments, one that was made by Alan Buchanan, the other one by David, about sort of a deja vu, from 25 years ago, and thinking about, issues dealing with genetic engineering or dealing with the nanotechnology. So the question that I have is that, are there lessons that we have learned either from the process or the outcomes of those discussions that would be very helpful for us in thinking about this issue?
Yeah. Alan, do you want to take a stab at that? Because you've been there before. Put your red light on. Counterintuitive. The red light means go.
You shouldn't assume that the Commission report making an impact on the bioethics literature is the same as making an impact on public opinion or public knowledge. That's one thing I would say. And the other is that I think that there's the danger that was brought up a minute ago of doing a report on synthetic biology without making it clear that it's just part and parcel of much larger issues about scientific innovation. Those are 2 lessons I think you can learn.
If I could respond to that too, I think one of the other lessons is that applications matter. The way the particular trajectory of the development of biotechnology, particularly with respect to genetically modified crops and food, ended up being an enormously polarizing debate that we still have repercussions from today. You could envision a different rollout of that technology that would have had a very different kind of worldwide greeting, I think. I think the other issue from a regulatory perspective is that I think we've certainly learned, particularly with the regulation of plants, that the goal of having 100% segregation of genetically engineered plants does not work. It's just not a feasible goal. Now, again, that goes back to the issue of containment and control. We may have a different opportunity here, but that issue has, in fact, created, while not environmental or health issues, has created some economic challenges for farmers, especially.
Public questions. We need the microphone. Go ahead.
Hi, yes. Gaiman Bennett. I'm the Director of Human Practices at the BioFab. Comment and then question. First, on the question of what I think that this commission should be focused on. We've heard a lot today about biosafety and questions of contamination, and a little bit about biosecurity and question of malicious action. I think a third agenda, which Dr. Endy raised on one of his slides, is a question of preparedness. If something negative happens, either unintentionally or intentionally, how are we prepared to respond? I think that the question of preparedness is particularly useful for this kind of a commission because it goes to practices, habits, and dispositions, which are at really at the heart of ethical matters. So that was my comment. The question I would like to pose to Drs. Kaebnick and Buchanan was the question that was actually raised in the morning, in both sessions in the morning. And I would like them to answer the question, but in light of comments that Professor King made in the afternoon. The question was, what is distinctive about synthetic biology today relative to other moments in the development of biotechnologies and genetic engineering in particular? And I took that question to mean what's really significant about it today. Okay. And this morning, when the question was posed, the response turned on what was distinctive about the technology. Professor King invited us in the afternoon to think about the way in which context makes something significant and relevant. So I'd like to ask Dr. Kaebnick and Dr. Buchanan if they could reflect on what's distinctive about the context within which synthetic biology is emerging that might tell us something about the ethical calculus.
Greg and Alan. Greg, you want to begin? Alan, you want to begin?
Well, I think the social political context is that people are very worried about environmental damage and global warming in particular, and so there might be a tendency to have unduly high expectations for synthetic biology, doing away with the need for fossil fuels or something. So that could distort the debate. But otherwise, I can't think of anything that's peculiar about the context that's different from the context in which genetic engineering has been evolving for the last couple of decades.
Thanks. Greg?
Yeah, I feel like anything I say about this is going to be very speculative and ill-founded, but synthetic biology is sometimes described as the beginning of a new industrial revolution. We've had one industrial revolution, and now that's sort of coming to an end, and we have an opportunity maybe to get in front of this whole new wave that might, as Jim has pointed out, completely overturn existing modes of production and distribution of a lot of basic goods. And so that strikes me as a salient consideration here.
Let me just turn the comment about preparedness into a question for any of the presenters, because we didn't really address that. We'll take some deep dives later into some of these, but does anybody have some insight on the preparedness issue and how we should approach it? Yes.
So I have a bunch of stuff in my head that's sort of the result of listening to many provocative comments throughout the day, and I'll do my best to stick to that to start with. So when the 1918 flu virus was first published and then the virus was reconstructed, there were a number of, let's call them vitriolic, public commentaries about how we just given bioterrorists the best weapon they ever had, forgetting how hard it was to rebuild the virus. If you talk to people who build viruses for a living, build pathogens particularly for a living, they fail most of the time. So whether it's SARS or the 1918 flu, whatnot, the funding, the tens of millions of dollars in funding that goes into efforts to rebuild pathogens to figure out how they work results in success a small fraction of the time. So I find it unlikely in the near term that any amateur is going to pull that off successfully. In the medium term, long term, I don't know, it's going to get easier. I believe it was Terence Tumpy who was partially responsible for helping reconstruct the 1918 flu. When the virus was published, among the public comments he made was that, yes, it's true, risks are increasing. Yes, it's true that it's becoming easier to write pathogens from scratch. But our real problem right now is that nature is the best bioterrorist.
And I would just go back to my comments about SARS this morning. If SARS were to come back today, we would have no better response capability than we did the first time. There's still no human vaccine for it. We would be better at diagnosing it, at finding it at the beginning, but it's unclear that we would have any better clinical response to it. And I suggest that that's probably true for most emerging pathogens. I hope, is Craig still here? No, Craig is, but I hope that, in fact, we get synthetic vaccines in the next year for the flu. Yeah. That would be fantastic. Yeah. My suspicion is that issues will arise, as they have for the last 5 to 10 years, thinking about synthetic vaccines that'll stand in the way.
Mm-hmm. There was a question. Yes, question.
This is a question to give you some historical perspective that you may know. In view of the fact that most, if not all, reports of presidential commissions have, in the last half century, have gone to the dead letter office, and in view of the polarizing issues that you're discussing, you have a difficult task of finding a way to make your deliberations consequential.
We do, indeed. Let me point out that that is the challenge of anybody who wants to make anything consequential in government. We are an advisory body, but let me just point out that President Clinton's NBAC was asked shortly after it was formed, like we have been asked by President Obama shortly after we have been formed. In the case of NBAC, it was asked to issue a report on cloning after Dolly was cloned. And that shortly after that report was issued, President Clinton actually agreed to some of the major recommendations of the report. Congress never acted on those recommendations, but several states did. And the report was quite influential. And aside from the fact that, as Drew has pointed out, the President has actually asked for recommendations and been very specific in our not only asking for recommendations, but constituting a commission that includes 3 members of relevant agencies that might be asked to consider some of these recommendations. The value of our report, if we write it clearly, is that it, far from going into the dustbin of history, it's actually there for the concerned public to read as a possible antidote to the immediate soundbite reactions that are almost always more extreme and more simplistic than the educated public and the concerned public, both here and abroad, would like. So that is our hope, expectation, and challenge. Thank you very much for expressing what I'm sure you are not unique in holding.
Hello, my name is Brian Wells. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Penn Medicine. I have the privilege at Penn of helping the clinicians and the researchers in their pursuit of the benefits of personalized medicine. Personalized medicine is the treatment of disease in an individual patient based on their genotype, not their phenotype. I'm curious as to what, are we too soon for the benefits of this technology in that realm, or, we have decades to go, or are we already seeing, are we on the verge of using synthetic biology to treat individual patient problems?
Interesting. Doctors, including doctors on the commission?
My sense is personalized medicine has decades to go with respect, and the contribution of synthetic biology is probably around personalized pharmaceuticals, the ability to manufacture individually tailored drugs within context on demand.
Yeah. Nelson.
I would just say that our state of understanding of genomics, genome research is still quite in its infancy. So I think that the public concern, which is rightful, about personalized medicine is not going to be realized by cogent work in the laboratory for quite some time.
Thank you.
I'm going to respectfully disagree a little bit here. I think personalized medicine is not necessarily about just going from the genome. You can integrate everything you currently have in medicine plus the genome. And secondly, I don't think it's so far away. We already have 1,800 genetic tests that are considered predictive and actionable, and personalized medicine is already having a huge impact in pharmacogenetics and in cancer. So synthetic biology plus personal genomics, I think, is uncertain, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily that far in the future.
Interesting. Drew?
I wanted to return to the public question from Dr. Bennett about context and just having the benefit of a couple minutes to reflect upon what's new.
Could I just get Raj then first, because he had an answer on the personalized medicine.
So I think, as you pointed out, right now we are utilizing genetic and genomic information to make diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment decisions, and that's what personalized medicine is. And many of the technologies to accomplish that are also technologies that are also used in many other aspects, including synthetic biology. So even though I do not see any direct, relevance to what we talked about today in terms of synthetic biology, the technologies are very, very similar.
Okay. Drew, you're on.
Again, just returning to the question of are there changes in context regarding ethics? And very practically, if I arbitrarily go back to circa 1975 and start with the early applications of recombinant DNA, security as a topic was not considered at Pacific Grove. The scientists thought, following the decisions in the Nixon administration to stand down offensive biological weapons programs, that was a solved problem. And if you talk to David Baltimore now, he'll admit that was naive and a mistake. And we live in a different world. We live in a world where people are concerned about security and terror. And that's a significant difference to the ethical landscape.
That's important.
I think another point of significance is that we're one human generation past the invention of genetic engineering. So Paul Berg is a distinguished colleague at Stanford, and I'm honored to be able to learn from him, but he's an emeritus faculty. And that means that as a new generation comes up after the first genetic engineering generation, we have the opportunity to pass along the accrued wisdom that's worth it, and maybe discard some baggage that is dysfunctional. And so that's I think we're at a very interesting point in time, 35 plus years post-genetic engineering. And a third thing that's quite significant that wasn't true when a lot of these earlier conversations in bioethics happened is the internet exists. And not to make a cliche of that, but people interact in many different ways, and there's new types of communities and new types of representation and new types of dialogue. And I haven't seen, it may exist, but I haven't seen a study of how this impacts the deliberation or practice of bioethics, but I bet it matters greatly.
Questions from commission members? Nelson.
So there was sort of a wide range of opinions from a number of you in terms of what the role that governments, I'll use the term instead of our single government, but governments, and what their stewardship of this process would be. And on one hand, there's been some discussion of having an executive agent or an executive process where there would be stewardship of multiple agencies that would allow there to be a public and transparent discourse that might replicate this kind of forum, but do it in perpetuity, and that may transcend the political nature of the appointment lengths of this kind of process. And then on the other hand, we heard that there are some concerns about the choke point of having information in the hands of governments that even under best of intentions that in the absence of some degree of transparency, the consolidation of that oversight could turn into something else. That was your dual use too. So what maybe would be the recommendations for what role governments should play so that you don't end up running afoul of either end of that spectrum?
Alan.
I think you minimize the last risk that you mentioned, the dual use too, if you think about international governance. It's less likely that one country will be able to sort of get hold of the good information, use it for nefarious purposes. I think one difference in context, Dr. Endes mentioned several. We now live, as opposed to say in 1975, we live in a world where international institutions are much more robustly developed than they've ever been. And I think that gives us an opportunity for international oversight and encouragement of the good uses of this technology that didn't exist before. So I would think about that. Think about which existing international institutions are such that you could piggyback some efforts for synthetic biology on them.
Which would you put on your list?
I haven't really thought about that question. I'm not sure whether it's a matter of piggybacking on something in the World Health Organization as a sort of a starting point, or whether some other sort of international venue is needed. But this just leads to another thing. I really think that you need somebody advising you, not me because I'm not qualified to do it, but somebody advising you on institutional design with respect to recommendations that you make that have implications for how either new institutions should be created or existing institutions should be modified to deal with these issues. I think you really need somebody who's an expert on institutional design to think about incentive compatibility, about when it's a matter of piggybacking on an existing institutional arrangement, either at the domestic level or internationally, when you need a genuinely new institution. And actually, your colleague, Bob Cohan, is probably the person I would go to first for advice on this.
Good. Say
yes,
I think, Allison, you said this, that as one of your recommendations, to ask the National Academy's Board of Life Sciences to make one of their reports, right? It's actually a really good idea. I mean, that's what they sit around and do. And then also all of the funding agencies, the government agencies, are invested in those reports. And so you can have this executive level recommendation, but if you want this to filter out to the science community, right, those reports, many of which end up on a shelf, but some of them are highly influential if they're timed right. And I think that to couple those two reports together could really give you some oomph, right, in this.
Do you agree that the subject should be the potential risks only or something?
Well, I think you can. So what's really good about NRC reports is that they help you craft the questions so you get maximum answers back. Like you know, it's not like you just get to give a question. They help to, and they're very good at that, refining it to make the question bigger, better, broader, if that's appropriate, or to say you need two reports, you know, one on risk, one on, I don't know, technology. But I think that to explore that avenue as just one little line in your report, to give it lasting, you know, that gives you much more than your 6-month time frame too, because those reports, you know, take a year. So
we don't expect our report to be immortal. It's just the recommendations will, you know, we want them to be self-replicating like the cells.
But just
right?
Automatically, in the spirit of the, but to give yourself traction, like automatic, extra traction.
Got it. Raj. Then Christine.
I want to ask a question, but I want to preface this by just a little history that many of us know about. So many issues that we talked about are indeed very similar to what happened in the mid-1970s when recombinant DNA, our ability to be able to splice molecules, really became available. At that time, first, at the Solomor meeting, there was a call for, a moratorium on doing additional work. And then, indeed, some parts of the country that I know very well, Princeton and Cambridge, for example, in the city, they completely banned the use of any of those kinds of technologies. And then, as a result of that, the National Institutes of Health, formed the Recombinant Advisory Committee, and they developed guidelines to how we'd be able to do research. And over the years, that has evolved. And over these, all of these years, they have continued to evolve, and we began to recognize that it wasn't as dangerous as people thought that it was going to be, and that we were able to reap the benefits from it, despite the social issues that we have with regard to the use of recombinant DNA technologies in plants and so on. And that was sort of considered as an example of how scientists are capable of regulating themselves in a reasonable fashion. Is that an example of a good model of how to do that, or that is, or are there other things that we have learned that say that is not a good model?
Yes, Rob.
I can't address that question directly, and I've been sort of mulling whether to bring this up or not, but I have a bit of a revisionist view of Asilomar and what happened there, and that comes from spending time with Sidney Brenner. I clearly was not there, but Sidney was. And his perspective on it has changed over the years, and now he looks back and says that that Asilomar was motivated by a desire to be just like the physicists, to have the power to destroy the world. And looking back on that, he says, well, clearly that was not correct, that the power of recombinant DNA then and today does not confer upon biologists the capacity that they sort of hope to have to compete culturally with physicists. The second thing that I would say about it is Asilomar brought to the fore a great number of promises, many of which have been borne out, not all of which, about the possibilities that recombinant DNA provides. It was also a chance to air a great many concerns and potential threats that the technology might bring forward. And I would observe that both the promise and the peril there were listed by the same individuals, by the scientists who went, and that, as we've just heard, many of the potential threats didn't turn out to be there. So Asilomar is a model for something, and I'm not sure it's the model to follow here, because the potential for self-promotion is pretty strong.
Christine.
I wanted to ask, seems like we've spent a lot of time talking about assessing risks and thinking about security and preparedness and all of that, but we've had a couple of comments that were more along the lines of recommendations that we might be able to make that would support or maybe enable responsible progress in this area. And I think the funding for implications research is one of those. The letting scientists be creative is one of those. But maybe there are others that we should think about. I mean, one of the ones I wondered about, let me just throw it out here, is that I sensed this morning that the integrating engineering and biology is something unique, and that maybe some kind of more interdisciplinary something or other, education or ongoing dialogue or something might be along the lines of what I'm thinking about. But anything like that, things that we might think about recommending that would support or enable responsible progress rather than just putting brakes on.
Can I just build on that question?
Sure.
So Dr. Prather had raised the idea earlier, potentially, of something like the synthetic biology standardization project, or something akin to like the Human Genome Research Project, which Dr. Venter disagreed with. I'm wondering, as you're answering this question, if that's something like a standardization project or something is something that would be useful in a way to enable the science and a useful role for the government or not.
Yes. And there should be good discussion about what such projects might be. So if you can build a genome, can you build, and it's software that makes its own hardware for burdened with those metaphors, and why not just call it wetware? But if we use those metaphors, how about an operating system, right? How about we make the engineering version of a genome project? And it's standardization and sharing and international and brings many people together and is really challenging. So I think there's tremendous opportunities around that. I tried to mention very quickly this morning what I consider to be a very important opportunity to have public investment sustained in tools development, and in particular DNA construction, but you could go into many different directions with that. So I think there are tremendous opportunities there. No one person should have the privilege of figuring that all out, but we have good mechanisms for research and technology communities to come together with public policy groups to figure that out.
David, on this point?
Yeah, I think one of the things the government can do is constantly monitor the changing structure of the industry as it grows. And we were doing this with nanotech is because a lot of the work spun out of universities, and all of a sudden you had thousands of small businesses. And so the kinds of interventions that you'd make, the kinds of government agencies that get involved with small businesses, the kinds of things that small businesses use are quite often very different than the Dow chemicals. So I think there's a tremendous need for something like the Department of Commerce to sort of say, what does the structure of this industry look like at this point in time? and how can we support them, whether they need capital, whether they need export promotion, whether they need help with biosafety. There's a different set of agencies and strategies. And I think the base of that is constantly monitoring the structure of the industry, and it's going to change as it moves along. And they'll have very different needs, and those needs will have to be answered quite often by different agencies and different outreach arms at different agencies.
Yes.
There are two ways the government can support something like this. One way is through the development of tools, and the other way is through directing the technology towards goals. So the government can support the creation of certain synthetic biology tools, or it can say we're giving X amount of money for the creation, for cures to the following disease or orphan diseases by synthetic biology means. So we have to differentiate the kinds of incentives that we're talking about to move it forward. It's probably premature for the latter to start. I mean, it's still basic enough that probably the most productive thing the government can do at this point right now is to support tools rather than goals. But it's probably not that much in the future where goals will become far more important and where there's an opportunity for the society as a whole through its governmental agents to say, given this enormously diverse set of activities, here are some of the places where we as a society want to put our resources to encourage you to accomplish the following things that are important to us.
Yeah. So we have heard loud and clear, and I'm not going to sum up today, and we have tomorrow as well, but I am going to draw this session to a close simply by saying we have heard loud and clear, albeit sometimes from different people, that we need to think about the potential benefits as well as the risks and harms. And let me just sum that point up by saying, going back to the social justice issue, there are people today and people who are not yet here today whose lives can be saved and enhanced by what science today, often unpredictably tomorrow, creates. There are also concomitant risks and harms that we need to take into account. And I think it was a wise charge that we received to take both into account. And all of the presenters together have addressed some of the benefits and the harms, and we will continue to pursue them and think about the institutional ways, domestic and international, in which those, on the one hand, harms minimized, risks minimized, but not going to zero, and benefits maximized. I know enough, since I started as a mathematician, to know you can't maximize and minimize at the same time, but we're going to think hard about this, and I really want to conclude by saying thank you to everybody who's attended, to the presenters today, and we look forward to the presenters tomorrow, and above all to my fellow commission members who have already shown that we have a commitment to this common enterprise. Thank you all for coming, and enjoy your evening. The what? If I could. That's great. Yeah, thank you.